Welcome to Trending Unpacked, the show where we explore the stories behind the trends shaping our world.
Great to be here.
Today, we're setting the dial to Dallas, Texas, to unpack a name that has become a critical flashpoint in the ongoing, really high-stakes debate over immigration enforcement, Joshua Jahn. This story is trending across pretty much every platform, not because the underlying facts are definitively clear, they're actually far from it.
Right, that's key.
But because it perfectly encapsulates the deep polarization, the, institutional conflicts, and the immense emotional charge surrounding federal enforcement actions right now.
That's the core tension we really need to analyze today. When we examine the source material surrounding the John case, our mission isn't really to adjudicate the specific incident or determine guilt or innocence.
No, definitely not.
The details are just too contested for that. Our job is to analyze the immediate fallout, the conflicting public narratives, this relentless polarization between pro-ICE and anti-ICE positions, and how this particular controversy has been culturally interpreted and amplified, how it lifted a local case to the status of, well, a national symbol.
Yeah.
Understanding how these flashpoints operate is, I think, essential to grasping the current state of U.S. immigration policy.
So we're going to spend the next little while really unpacking the components of this controversy. We'll look at the ground-level context in Dallas, the actual agency involved.
ICE, yeah.
And then how these ideological battles play out across the digital landscape. It's a complex story, definitely, but one that offers some incredible specific insights into modern American political discourse and, frankly, how we consume information.
And to do that effectively, we have to maintain strict neutrality. We're focusing solely on the perspectives and the facts presented in the source materials we have.
Right.
This is all about ensuring you, the listener, get the full, balanced picture without us endorsing any single viewpoint.
Absolutely. We promise to keep it grounded and focused on the facts as presented in the materials. And hey, before we dive in fully, just a quick note on what's coming up next time.
Oh, yeah.
Once we finish analyzing this political flashpoint, we'll shift gears entirely toward entertainment. We're going to unpack the big reveal of the America's Got Talent 2025 winner.
Okay, quite the shift.
It is. But first, let's get into the heart of Dallas and the Joshua Jahn case. Okay, let's start with the central figure, Joshua Jahn. According to the sources we looked at, he's the focal point of debate. That's the phrase they use. It's because of his connection to a controversial federal enforcement action in Dallas. But if the individual details are contested, like you said, what makes him such a powerful magnet for public debate?
Well, that transformation. It's interesting. Going from a private individual to a public focal point. That happens when the individual story gets systematically elevated. It becomes an avatar, really, for a broader systemic issue. John isn't just a person involved in an incident anymore, His name instantly triggers discussions about civil liberties, immigration enforcement tactics, community-federal relations, the whole 9 yards.
Because the incident itself touches on these deeper issues.
Exactly. Whatever its specific truth, and that's the contested part, it touches upon deeply pre-existing cultural fault lines. His personal narrative has almost been stripped down and maybe weaponized is too strong a word, but certainly used by both sides to argue about the entire U.S. immigration system.
Okay, so to understand the system at play here, we need to clarify the agency involved. We keep saying ICE. For a listener who wants to be really well informed, what exactly is ICE and what's its specific mandate that leads to this kind of friction in a city like Dallas?
That's a really crucial clarification. So ICE stands for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. It's a federal agency, sits under the Department of Homeland Security.
DHS, right.
And its primary mandate, the part that's relevant to this case, is interior enforcement. That means identifying, apprehending, detaining, and ultimately deporting undocumented immigrants or those who have violated U.S. immigration laws.
So inside the U.S., not just at the border.
Precisely. Critically, ICE operates within the U.S. They do things like workplace raids, targeted arrests, and operations to enforce removal orders that have already been issued.
So their very function, this interior enforcement, seems like it's almost structurally designed to create friction when it's applied in places like Dallas, these high-density, culturally diverse environments.
That's a good way to put it.
And the location here, Dallas, is specifically cited in our sources as a flashpoint. Why Dallas? What makes it a flashpoint?
Dallas is critical because it represents this specific intersection of demographics and politics. It's a huge, sprawling, diverse metropolitan hub. It has a massive, vibrant immigrant population, many with deep roots, civic ties, businesses.
Right, integrated into the city.
Very much so. Yet, it sits within Texas, a state that often pushes for, let's say, aggressive border security and pretty robust interior enforcement measures.
Ah, so state versus city dynamics too.
Absolutely. The sources indicate that the Dallas region specifically has a history of cases highlighting this friction between local communities who are often focused on trust building, integration, keeping families together, and federal authorities executing a legal mandate that often involves separation and removal. The Jahn case just provides this perfect, immediate illustration of that systemic conflict playing out.
And the source material defines IC's role as executing operations that often spark public protest and political backlash. That seems almost inevitable then. When federal agencies like ICE operate locally, especially doing enforcement, how does that friction typically show up in Dallas?
Well, it often manifests through conflicting policy approaches. You might see local governments or even police departments adopt policies that limit their cooperation with federal immigration efforts.
Sometimes called sanctuary policies, though that term is loaded.
Exactly. The terminology varies, and it's definitely loaded.
Right.
But the goal is often to promote community trust.
Right.
Right, and making sure people feel safe reporting crimes or accessing city services, regardless of status.
Okay.
Federal authorities, however, are mandated to enforce federal law, regardless of those local policies. So when an enforcement action like the one reportedly involving Joshua Jahn occurs, it immediately politicizes all local law enforcement operations, even if they weren't directly involved.
Wow.
And it instantly catalyzes pre-existing local political organizations and activist networks who are, frankly, often waiting for precisely this kind of event to highlight their concerns.
And here we get to what you call the engine driving the national controversy, the contested details. This feels absolutely fundamental to understanding the whole narrative, doesn't it?
It is the central mechanism. If the core facts were unambiguous, if everyone agreed on what happened, the public debate would likely move much faster to a policy critique. Should this policy exist? Is it effective?
Right, a different kind of debate.
But the sources really stress that the Jahn situation is defined by ambiguity. Your understanding of the incident, whether you see it as a procedural error, a terrible act of overreach, or simply the lawful execution of duty, depends entirely on which outlet, which commentator, which social media feed you follow.
Can you give an example? Like, what kind of details are contested?
Sure. For example, some reports might focus exclusively on the legal paperwork. Was the appropriate judicial warrant present? Was it properly served according to procedure? Others might ignore that and focus entirely on the alleged level of force used during the apprehension.
Or maybe the person's history.
Or the compliance level of the individual involved. Was there resistance? Was there cooperation? These aren't small details. They fundamentally change the nature of the event depending on which version you accept.
So if side A is shouting that Jahn was targeted without due cause, maybe constitutional rights were violated, and side B is shouting just as loudly that Jahn was a known offender, maybe with a prior order, and all proper procedures were meticulously followed. And both those claims are amplified equally instantly through digital channels. The public is kind of left in this state of, what, epistemological uncertainty.
That's a great term for it, yeah. And what do people do with uncertainty? They fill that void with their existing political beliefs, their priors. Precisely. The ambiguity acts as a perfect canvas for projection and, importantly, confirmation bias.
Okay.
This contested nature maximizes the polarization because neither side has to concede an undeniable, uncomfortable fact. They can simply point to the version of the incident that affirms their existing political reality. And that's why the specific incident itself often remains fiercely debated long after the initial event. The debate serves a different purpose.
Let's delve deeper into these core thematic conflicts that get exposed by this ambiguity. The sources mention civil rights and due process. What specific legal questions are critics typically raising in enforcement cases like this one?
The legal scrutiny here gets intense, and it's fundamental. Critics consistently question whether the processes ICE followed in a given instance respected the fundamental constitutional rights and due process guarantees. These are rights available, by the way, to all individuals within the country, irrespective of their current immigration status. That's a key point.
Okay, like what specifically?
Well, often it involves Fourth Amendment concerns. Searches and seizures were warrant specific. Were they based on probable cause? Or was it more of a, generalized sweep? Then there are Fifth Amendment concerns regarding deprivation of liberty without due process. Specifically, critics ask, was the individual properly informed of their rights? Did they understand they could seek legal counsel? Sometimes this gets framed as a Miranda warning equivalent for non-citizens, though the specifics differ legally. And then there are often questions about potential racial profiling, or whether excessive, unnecessary force was used during the apprehension itself. Raising this civil rights banner essentially challenges the entire procedural legitimacy of the operation. It's a powerful argument.
And those legal arguments then clash directly with this other theme the sources identify, the institutional mandate of public safety versus compassion. How do supporters of ICE enforcement typically frame the public safety argument, maybe in the context of the Jahn case or similar ones?
For those supporting the enforcement action, the framing is usually very strict. It's about institutional necessity and the rule of law. The public safety argument basically posits that ICE isn't acting arbitrarily. They are executing the law as written by Congress and mandated by the executive branch, full stop.
So it's about order.
Exactly. Supporters argue that legal adherence is non-negotiable for a functioning society. If rules regarding legal entry or residency are broken, then enforcement must follow, regardless of how complex or, frankly, unfortunate the individual circumstances might appear. This side prioritizes stability, order, and the non-selective application of legal statutes. It's about the system working as designed.
Okay. Conversely, the critics shift the focus entirely away from just legality towards compassion, arguing the current enforcement system disproportionately harms families and communities. How does that argument play out?
This perspective really moved the debate from legality to morality and human impact. Critics argue that even if the law is being technically followed to the letter,
Right.
the consequences of the current enforcement mechanism, things like family separation, the immediate destabilization of communities, creating an environment where people are afraid to access essential services like healthcare or schools.
Yeah, the chilling effect.
Exactly, that chilling effect. They argue that this damage outweighs the institutional gain of that specific enforcement action. The Jahn case, because it got amplified nationally, serves as a potent illustration for them of this perceived systemic flaw, that a rigid federal structure can result in unintended and disproportionate cruelty, often impacting individuals who, they argue, pose no real threat to public safety and have significant community ties, jobs, kids in school, mortgages. This focus forces a discussion about ethical governance, even when legal statutes are technically being followed. It asks, is this the right way to govern?
So we have these two very different moral and legal systems colliding, basically, over one contested incident in Dallas.
Pretty much.
And the source materials note something interesting about the initial amplification. They say it was driven by online news cycles, targeted hashtags, activist posts. That suggests the narrative was already taking shape before traditional media could verify anything, right?
That immediate digital reaction is absolutely critical to understand here. It means that the initial framing, whether it was the anti-ICE cry of unjust targeting or the pro-ICE assertion of law and order upholding, became the default lens through which vast numbers of people first encountered the story.
Before the facts were in.
Long before the slow, methodical process of verification and traditional reporting could even take place. It's a hallmark of contemporary controversies, isn't it? The digital reaction time dictates the public discourse, not the time it takes to confirm what actually happened on the ground in Dallas. The narrative gets set in stone very quickly.
Okay, let's turn our attention squarely to that digital ecosystem then, because this seems to be where the Jahn controversy really transformed from a local incident into a national spectacle. We're dealing with, as you said, two highly explicit digital narratives fighting for absolute dominance. How do these two camps use framing to mobilize public opinion, especially when the details are contested?
Well, the digital sphere rewards rhetorical simplicity and emotional punch. That's what goes viral. So both the pro-IC and anti-IC narratives employ these classic political framing techniques designed for maximum emotional resonance and, crucially, shareability.
Okay, break down the pro-IC narrative first. How do they frame it online?
The pro-IC narrative really leans on the rhetorical pillar of institutional integrity. It's framed almost purely as law enforcement simply doing its job.
Right.
The focus is on the rule of law, the necessity of federal authority, the dangers of noncompliance. Digital talking points often use phrases emphasizing legal necessity, national sovereignty, border security, even if it's an interior case.
Okay.
If you accept that frame, the incident isn't really a human tragedy or even particularly controversial. It's just a necessary, maybe unpleasant, but ultimately routine action required to maintain order, non-controversial.
And the anti-ICE narrative, how do they counter that? They leverage the emotional and moral high ground, framing it as the unjust targeting of individuals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This narrative uses the imagery and language of compassion, civil liberties, resistance against perceived overreach. They directly question the moral justification of the enforcement action itself. Was this enforcement necessary to this degree right now, in this way? Was the potential mishandling or the alleged aggressive approach towards Jahn justified even if technically legal? This framing appeals directly to groups already concerned with systemic injustice, racial profiling, things like that. It places the individual, the human story, in direct opposition to what they portray as the impersonal, powerful machinery of the federal government. The goal is to elicit empathy and mobilize protest based on moral outrage.
What's really striking is how the ambiguity, those contested details we keep coming back to, is the perfect fuel for both of these very strong mutually exclusive frames.
Oh, absolutely. It allows people to selectively consume and share the information that confirms their existing biases. It creates a kind of self-reinforcing loop online.
Awesome.
Because the source information is ambiguous, the claims that tend to be most effective online are the ones that are clearest, most emotionally potent, not necessarily the ones that are most factually accurate or nuanced.
Right. Nuance doesn't usually go viral.
Almost never. And this brings us directly to this concept of the misinformation risk, which the sources highlight as being central to why this case went so viral.
Explain that mechanism. The speed of spread versus the accuracy of the claim. How does that work in a case like John's?
Okay, the critical insight here, according to the sources, is that online claims related to the Jahn case, regardless of whether they actually align with official records or verified facts, spread with devastating speed.
Faster than truth puts its boots on, as they say.
Much faster. We're talking about rumors, maybe exaggerations, potentially even outright fabrications related to the incident itself, or the individual's background, or the conduct of the officers involved. Think about the time differential. A verified, cross-referenced, neutral statement from an official source, maybe correcting a misunderstanding. That might take a law enforcement agency or traditional news outlet days to properly vet, write, clear through legal, and distribute.
Yeah, bureaucracy.
Meanwhile, a brief, highly emotional, maybe completely inaccurate tweet or a meme claiming a grave injustice that can be read and retweeted to tens, hundreds of thousands of users in seconds. Literally seconds.
That really is the central mechanism we need you, the listener, to understand about modern news consumption, isn't it? The claims that achieve the highest level of virality are often those designed specifically for emotional impact and velocity, not necessarily those grounded in careful, factual validation.
And once that initial, often inaccurate or incomplete narrative gets established in the public consciousness, once the hashtag is trending, the images have been shared millions of times, it becomes incredibly difficult to overwrite or correct it. Even if definitive factual evidence emerges later, that contradicts the viral narrative. The misinformation, or even just the highly slanted framing, effectively sets the tone for the entire subsequent public debate. It anchors the conversation.
So beyond this immediate fight over facts, procedures, and viral narratives, the Jahn controversy has apparently been used to open up much wider cultural discussions. How does a single local enforcement action in Dallas become a platform for debating huge systemic issues like race, class, and justice in America?
This is that transformation we talked about earlier, from incident to symbol. Once the case gained visibility, various advocacy groups and communities immediately leveraged it. They used it as a powerful contemporary example to discuss these much larger pre-existing systemic struggles they've been concerned about for years.
So they move beyond just debating the arrest protocol.
Exactly. They start discussing who the system targets. They might bring in demographic data related to enforcement actions in the Dallas area specifically. They debate whether protection under the law is truly applied equally, regardless of someone's economic status or their racial or ethnic background.
So for communities that already feel marginalized or perhaps over-policed, the Jahn case becomes, what? Concrete proof of their broader experience.
Precisely. It allows them to link what they see happening on the ground, these local policy outcomes, directly to these big national dialogues about equity, systemic power imbalances, historical injustices. The controversy transforms into a kind of contemporary parable about the state of justice in America for certain groups.
And that guarantees the continued online interest in the partisan framing, doesn't it? Regardless of the final legal outcome of John's specific case.
Absolutely. The legal resolution, in many ways, becomes almost irrelevant to the ongoing political and cultural debate, because the symbolic function of the controversy has already been served. It's already done its work in the public sphere.
Okay, so let's try to bring all these threads together. We have the contested facts on the ground in Dallas, the incredible velocity of digital polarization, this fundamental clash between institutional mandates and civil liberties. What does the Joshua Jahn controversy ultimately reveal about the fundamental difficulties in U.S. immigration enforcement actions today?
Well, what's really fascinating, or perhaps troubling, depending on your perspective, is that cases like this reveal the inherent, maybe unavoidable, difficulty in translating broad, universal federal immigration law into fair, localized enforcement actions. especially in these highly specific, nuanced, and culturally versed settings like Dallas.
Federal law is one size fits all, but communities aren't.
Pretty much. Federal law is designed to be sweeping, universal, but its application hits the ground in a way that's anything but universal. When enforcement meets a community, it hits the highly personalized, tangible reality of human lives, families, businesses, schools, local political systems. The law might be abstract on paper, but its consequences are painfully concrete for the people involved.
It almost sounds like you're saying the U.S. enforcement system is structurally designed to create this kind of controversy in diverse environments. Is that fair?
It's a strong way to put it, but there's an argument for it. Because the mandate of interior enforcement often seems to be in direct, perhaps unavoidable conflict with other important goals, like social cohesion and community trust, which local authorities are often trying very hard to maintain.
Right.
Our synthesis of the conflicts, remember, civil rights versus law enforcement, public safety versus compassion, shows that this continuous clash, when it's documented instantly and amplified globally by social media, ensures that immigration policy remains this perennial, explosive crisis point in American political life. Every single local enforcement action carries the potential to be the match that ignites a national firestorm.
And within that firestorm, we absolutely must focus on the human and emotional side. Critics consistently highlight this, stating the system disproportionately harms families and communities. This is where the policy stops being abstract and becomes deeply personal, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this emotional gravity is what gives the anti-ICE narrative, in particular, its necessary power to sustain virality online. We are talking about measurable human cost here, stuff that goes far beyond legal paperwork or court filings.
Like what?
Well, when families are separated due to an enforcement action, when parents are detained suddenly, or when individuals are removed from communities they've lived in for years, the emotional toll just ripples outward. It impacts children's sense of security, their stability, their educational continuity. It impacts the local economic fabric. Businesses lose workers. Landlords lose tenants.
Right.
Critics argue, often very effectively in the court of public opinion, that the moral and sociological damage created by this climate of fear and separation often outweighs whatever institutional necessity might be cited for that immediate enforcement action.
So this emphasis on the emotional lens, it really forces the policy debate beyond just dry legal statutes, doesn't it? It pushes it into these critical discussions of ethical governance, proportionality, and it reminds you, the listener, that behind every trending hashtag, behind every news report, there are real individuals whose lives are profoundly, sometimes irrevocably, affected by these highly polarized policy debates. The argument isn't abstract. It's tangible reality happening right now in places like Dallas.
And that tangible emotional reality is precisely why these stories trend and sustain public interest. So if we look at the full picture now, why do cases with this specific DNA, high-stakes subject matter like immigration, highly emotional themes like family and justice, and crucially, those contested facts, why do they guarantee extreme polarization? What's the final synthesis of that mechanism?
Yeah, what's the takeaway on the polarization itself?
I think it's the perfect viral combination, and it's built on that foundation of ambiguity, the high-stakes nature of immigration. That guarantees immediate media and public attention. The emotional themes of family, justice, fairness. Yeah. That guarantees deep engagement. People feel strongly. But the key ingredient for the intense polarization is the ambiguity, those contested details. Because the facts aren't settled, people aren't required to do the really difficult cognitive work of processing nuanced information that might actually challenge their existing worldview.
It's easier to stick with what you already believe.
Much easier. Instead, they can just project their existing political framework onto the ambiguity. It confirms what they already thought was true.
So if I already believe that, say, the government often uses excessive force and profiles minorities, then the contested details coming out of Dallas serve as immediate proof that my worldview is correct. But if I already believe that rules must be strictly followed to protect the nation and maintain order, then those same contested details suggest that the critics are just trying to obstruct justice or make excuses.
That is the exact consequence of ambiguity in our hyper-partisan digital age. The lack of clarity allows for immediate, often unchallengeable partisan framing based purely on confirmation bias. So ultimately, what makes the Joshua Jahn controversy so divisive, so explosive, it's less the event itself.
Right.
Since, as we stressed, we can't definitively confirm all the details from the sources.
Right.
And it's much more about the deep-seated, pre-existing cultural fault lines it instantly exposes. Fault lines regarding race, class, access to justice, and fundamentally, who deserves protection and belonging under the U.S. legal and social system.
Yeah.
It functions like a precise mirror, really, showing us exactly where America's fundamental divides lie right now.
Wow. That's a powerful way to frame it. This has been a really critical, detailed analysis of how these local enforcement actions are almost instantly transformed into national symbols and, frankly, political rallying cries. So, to briefly summarize our unpacking today, the Joshua Jahn controversy is a powerful example of how local events get driven into the national consciousness, largely by online narratives often built on contested or incomplete information.
Yeah.
The controversy ultimately reveals maybe less about one specific case in Dallas and much more about the deep structural tensions inherent in enforcing federal immigration law within America's diverse communities.
And perhaps, as you, the listener, continue to navigate the constant stream of news, especially when you're confronting these high-profile controversies where the details are openly contested, here's maybe an important framework to consider.
Okay.
When you're consuming information about a conflict like this one, what framework should you personally adopt to try and distinguish between genuine, verified reports, purposeful partisan framing designed to persuade you, and maybe even outright misinformation?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
It is. Understanding the intent behind the narrative and the structure of how it's being presented is often the most important defense against accidental polarization or just being misled, thinking about how you're being told the story.
That is an excellent thought to leave us with. Thank you so much for engaging with the material and helping us unpack this incredibly complex narrative today.
My pleasure. Always interesting.
And before we sign off, remember what's coming next. We promise a total change of pace. We'll shift gears from politics to entertainment as we unpack the big reveal of the America's Got Talent 2025 winner. We hope you'll join us then.